Welcome, good evening. This is our first session as we really launch into studying the actual text of Deuteronomy. And this week you guys read about 18 verses, and so we're going to try to get through all 18 verses. But we're going to do some more introductory stuff since we are in the introduction of Deuteronomy. Verses 1 through 5 are an introduction to the whole book, so we're going to spend some time there. We're going to breeze through some of the things because it's a little bit of a review from last week. And then we will get into what Moses is actually, as he begins to speak to the people. We're going to start tonight with kind of an elementary exercise, if you guys can remember, because as I was reading it, and I was thinking, okay, these first 5 verses seem very boring, kind of like, all right, then these are the words of Moses when they were in the wilderness east of Jordan. Then you get a bunch of names that no one knows how to say, and so we just skim through it. But they are setting something up for us. So it's important that we ask some questions. And the elementary part of this exercise is to remember what 6 questions we're going to ask. Anyone want to guess? And? How? Who, what, when, why, where, and how, but not in that order. But we are going to start with the who. And tonight's lesson is going to be split into kind of 2 sections. We're going to do Deuteronomy 1 through 5, and then we're going to switch and do verses 6 through 18. Because Deuteronomy 1 through 5 really is an introduction to the entire book, and then his first address begins in verse 6. So we're going to kind of separate them out. But to start with, we're going to go through those 6 questions, and we're going to start with who. Now the answer to that one's easy. It's Moses. It's given there. We went over it quite a bit last week. So just as a reminder, Moses is the leader of the Israelites. He is 120 years old at this time. In Jewish tradition, that is an exemplary, much longer than normal life. If you read, I think it's Psalm 90, it's a Psalm of Moses. It says, 70 years is given to a man, 80 if he's blessed, but he's lived to 120. Like he has lived beyond that expectation, and he's lived into something great. He spent 40 years in the palace. He spent 40 years kind of trying to just live his life. And then he spent 40 years leading these people, communing with God one-on-one, face-to-face. So the highs and lows of his life are contained in these 40 years. And also last week we talked about how these are his last addresses to Israel. He's going to die soon. That he is in the location he knows he's going to die. They are directly across from the promised land, and he doesn't get to go in. And so these are his last pastoral pleas. These are not a judge giving out the law. These are not a king setting forth statutes. This is a pastor making his last final pleas to the people. And I think that's one of the really important things to keep in our mind as we read through Deuteronomy, which will change the tone in which we hear a lot of what Moses is delivering. Okay, so that's the who. Second question we're going to do is the when. All right, I love the shade that whether Moses framed the introduction here or it was a later editor that they give in verse 3. Normally, it takes only 11 days to get from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. That means where they're at from Mount Sinai, it should take how long to get there? But how long does it take them? 40 years. So when is this happening? This is happening 40 years after they have left Mount Sinai. You guys, if you did the questions this week, you just did a brief review of Numbers 13 through 14, which talks about why it didn't take just 11 days. Why, after they left Mount Sinai, they went to a different area south of the Promised Land, and they didn't go in. They said, nope, not doing that. We're going to get killed. And then they said, okay, we will do that. And then they got killed, and then Moses said to them through God, here's the deal. None of you who are over 20 years old get to go in because you didn't believe him. Because you thought your children would die, you're going to die. And now the children are there as adults standing there after 40 years. It's been a long time. You guys, I am 38 years old. I always have to think about that. Can you imagine that? There's that part of me that's like, whoa, I'm almost 40. But it would have been my whole life. For almost everyone in this room, it'd be the bulk of your life having wandered around a desert. We feel like we don't know what's going to happen or where we're going, or life's just this big mess. Literally 40 years in a desert. Just the same thing every day. Go out and get your manna, decide if you're staying, pull up your tent, move to the next location, put down your tent, stay there for weeks or days, collect your manna, then move on. Just this incessantness of not knowing where you're supposed to be going, but knowing you're not going to get there. And just watching people die off, one after one. 40 years. It's been a long time. But also important about the when is that it's been 40 years. But we also are told in verse 3 that it's after the victories over King Og and King Sihon. So these are victories that happened at the very end of Numbers. So these are not victories that were fought by the previous generation. These are battles that were fought by this generation. And I think that's really crucial for us to understand, because this younger generation were either teenagers or younger or not alive when Pharaoh's army was swallowed by the sea. They didn't see it. And if they did, they weren't really old enough to comprehend it, right? To really understand the meaning. They didn't have personal experience with what it was like to be scared for their little ones, to think this army is going to kill us. This army is going to pursue us. They're going to catch us. They're stronger than us, and we're going to die. But now they have this experience of God taking them to an army, and they won. And they went to another army, and they won. So they've had this 40 years of doing nothing, but now they also have 40 years, or they have this recent experience of seeing God come through. Because I think sometimes that's what we need, right? It's one thing to try and believe God and trust him, and Moses is reminding these people, you have these promises, but you actually have this experience. A lot of what he's going to say to the people is a communal experience, meaning they didn't really experience it for themselves. They're supposed to just identify with their group, but this was their victory. This was their fight against somebody, and they won. It's also that if you go back in Numbers, it's also where those really cool stories come in where they hire the guy come curse the Israelites so we'll beat them. He's like, okay. He's like, and then he blesses them. And they're like, we said curse, and then he blesses them again. Literally these people had to be blessed because Yahweh was with them. So we have the who, it's Moses. When? 40 years when it should have been 11, but also right after some victories of their own. Where? We are told twice that it is east of the Jordan River, in verse 1 and verse 5. It is in the wilderness east of the Jordan. It is not the same location, as I mentioned, as the first attempt. So when the previous generations had come in, it was in the south, where they could have just walked in, it was just land. If we're just going to walk in. They are east of the Jordan, as we'll find out in Joshua when you continue to read the story. It's swollen, the rains have come. It's at flood stage. And many commentators believe, but why did God do this? Why is it a separate area? What does it matter? One of the big matters is that it's a river, because they're going to have to cross it. And like we said, most of these people didn't experience crossing the Red Sea. They didn't see with their own eyes God holding the water back as they walked back on dry land. And almost as a gift to them, it's this was your experience. Whether or not you were alive with your parents or whether or not you were 5, this experience of walking through the water, this experience of me drawing you out, bringing you through safety, me performing the miraculous is your story, and I'm going to bring you through. So I imagine that, I don't know how much the plan Moses had laid out, but there might have been a few of them that were how's this going to work? All we can see is this big river in front of us. How are we going to get everybody across it? How's that going to work? And so there they sit. They also have, they're in a mountain range, and it's the mountain on which, close to the mountain on which Moses will die, and on which Moses will be buried. It's also, they're on land that some of the tribes of Israel have already claimed. They've asked for it to be their land, so that's going to be their home from now on. So in some ways, they are, while they have not entered what has historically been the parameters of the Promised Land, they are sitting in what is now Israel, what is now their nation, as those tribes will put up their permanent residence there. So we've done the who, the when, the where. Why? Why is Moses doing this? The first reason is in verse 3, it says, but for 40 years after the Israelites left Egypt, then Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything Yahweh had commanded him to say. The first reason Moses is doing this is because God told him to. He has spent 40 years doing what God told him to, whether or not he wanted to. The idea of giving final words to the people of encouragement and instruction and pleading and songs that they would memorize, this is God's idea. He knows how much people need those things. He knows how much we need final words of encouragement. He knows that we need our leaders or those in authority or those who've been with us for so long. We need those words. Just think about this week, how much the queen's children needed those last words from her. How much people have put up the last pictures of her. They need that last picture of her doing her job. The people who have led us for so long, they have power and influence over us. And God knew that the people needed that. Tell them the last things. Get up there a couple more times and leave them. Just put it all out there. Put it all out there. They need this. They will need it. It is just one more sign of God's grace. This is not an over-domineering man who has been harsh throughout his leadership, who's got to be like, I'm going to lay down the law one last time because you guys screw up and you never get it. So here, I got to do it again, and I got to tell you what you need to hear because I know you're going to mess it up. No, this is a man who says, you guys are precious to me and to the God who chose you, and he wants nothing but the best for you. So I am begging you, I am pleading you, listen to what I am about to say, because in these words are life. It is a plea, it is passionate, it is compassionate, it is not domineering. It also says in verse 3, that he is going to explain it is verse 5, sorry. I don't know what your translation says, but it says Moses carefully explained the Lord's instructions as follows. It could be explain, expound is another translation for that verb, or make plain. In other words, it's going to be clear what is expected of you, what God requires of you, who God is. I'm going to make that clear. There is no hiddenness. There is no secret code you have to crack. There is no levels of wisdom you have to claw your way up to be sure. Those of you who have studied with me before, I often hand out a poem that was found in the ancient Near East, and it's called To an Unknown God. And you guys, it is the saddest poem you have ever read. It is this man's poem, and he is pleading, to the God I don't know, tell me what I did wrong. To the God whose name I don't know, what do I need to do? And it is over a page of pleas to a God whose name he doesn't know to tell him what to do. Just tell me what I got to do to make you happy. I think we all understand that desperation in some relationship. We're like, just tell me what it is you want me to do. The Israelites don't have to worry about that because Moses is going to stand up there and make it plain. God is not a God who hides it. He's not a God of gotcha. He's not a God who's like, should have known better. He's gonna tell you. And if you don't see the grace in that, we have been so trained, and I think part of it is just American culture, history, individualism. We were revolutionaries. We do not like to be told what to do. Do not tell me what to do. I'm gonna decide. And so anytime we see someone giving instructions, or giving directions, or laying down the law, as the phrase goes, we think it's bad, we think it's negative, we think someone is encroaching on our freedom. But if anyone has taught children, or has children, or even has just enough wisdom to think back on their younger self, you realize that in boundaries there is freedom. In knowledge of knowing what is expected and how to get there, there's actually abundance to live, more than when you try and make up the rules for yourself, because what always happens is they become very self-serving rules. If we are left to dictate the own terms, the only one who's going to benefit from those terms is us. And everything around us is going to be destroyed. But God's purpose is for life for all, for everyone to enjoy abundant life. And so if they can all agree as a community that we're going to live in these wise guidelines, then there will be life for everyone. All right, who? Moses. When? 40 years after some significant victories. 40 years and then some significant victories. Where? Wilderness east of the Jordan. Why? Because Yahweh told him to, and to explain all the instructions. What is he explaining? This comes in verse 5. Most of you in your translations, it will probably say something to explain the Lord's law. What is? Read the end of verse 5. Anyone want to volunteer real quick? Expound this law. Explain this law. Expound. But all of them are going to say this law. I'm going to encourage you, urge you, as we travel through Deuteronomy together, whenever you see the word law, if you don't write in your Bible, that's fine, but I want you to read instruction. Because the Hebrew word it is translating is Torah. The translation, law, is a tradition going back to the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was used since a couple hundred years before Christ was born. But that creates two complications for us. It's not necessarily that it's wrong. I just want to explain 2 reasons why it can be confusing to us, why it can make it difficult to grasp what's actually going on. First of all, ancient law codes, so what's happening 2,000, 1,000 years BC, is not the same as American Western civilization statutory law codes. We have books of laws. If you've ever been to a lawyer's house or gone to a law library, there's like books, right? Books and books of laws, and they're constantly writing new ones. I mean, they passed like, you guys remember when the ACA passed, the Affordable Care Act? And like someone was reading it and it was like, one law was like this many pages. And our laws, even our criminal laws, like there's categories. You know, there's a felony and there's misdemeanors and there's A's and there's B's. And then those categories have the punishments over here. They're very well detailed and everything is covered. And it's called a statutory law system. And they basically pertain to every situation, and when they don't, we make a new one. Like, okay, I mean, I always think of buses have to stop at railroad tracks because that is what Schoolhouse Rock told us on how a bill becomes a law. And now you're all singing it in your head. Ancient law codes, though, were not the same. They weren't the laws by which a judge would get up there and be like, well, you did this. And now that's a Class C felony, so this is going to be your punishment. That's not at all how it would function. Ancient law codes were usually written down by the sovereign or the king. Think Hammurabi, right? Code of Hammurabi is one we're familiar with. And it was a means to display wisdom. Like, listen to this law, and this displays the wisdom that I know and how we're going to display it in our community. Like, this reflects our culture. As the one talking for the God, this king is displaying his wisdom and knowledge on how their culture, how their community is going to run. So it's more based on principles and values than it is on what's allowed and disallowed. Like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. For example, just think about some of the biblical laws that you know. For example, in the 10 Commandments, we're told not to steal or not to bear false witness. Other places, you are told in the Torah, you might be told to use accurate weights. So what we're being told isn't like, oh, you use dishonest weights. What's more being revealed is this is a community that values honesty, that values truth, that we are going to do all of our interactions with one another truthfully. The parapets, the fences on the roof, you guys, if you've ever heard, like that's one of the weird ones, or the ox goring one. Like, if your ox is known to gore, like, then you're responsible. Or even no adultery. These types of codes, yes, like it is protecting property and when are you responsible? But really what it's highlighting is we value our neighbors' safety and their life. Like, we treat our neighbors and we protect them and we honor them, because all of those laws are pertaining how you respond to someone else. Is your stuff, is your life more important, or is it about community life and respecting other people? Or like the mixing fabrics and food one, which is always a real strange one to people. Those are laws that helped visualize and concretize for the people holiness, of not mixing things, of being separate, of being called out, their status. Like, it had no moral value, but it was a lived out way of living out their status. So hopefully that kind of helps you see that the way laws are given in all of their ancient cultures, they're not thinking about them as 21st century Americans. And so that's one of the hesitations when you see law. What you're going to grab onto is what you're used to, what you're familiar with. We're constantly surrounded by the idea of law and Congress making laws, and then there's ordinances and all these things. And we might be prone to draw our modern meaning into the ancient text. And we need to make sure that we're letting the text be what it is, and that we're letting Torah be what it is without us telling it what it should be. I always want to make sure that we keep a humble posture when we come to the text, because this is written in ancient times. We do not know its language. We do not know its culture. We are so removed, yet God gives it to us, and he gives us his spirit, but we have some work to do to enter into that culture, to enter into that context, and not be so self-centered as we so often can be, and think like, well, my context translates. Because then we will, Torah loses some of its meaning, what it's doing theologically, and how it can also be meaningful for us today. All right, the second reason translating I would love for you to like take Torah and put instruction instead of law, is that Torah, it doesn't come from any legal word. It actually comes from the verb to teach. Like in Hebrew, the verb horah means to teach. It doesn't mean to give laws or to legislate or anything it's not part of like a semantic legal range. It is part of the teaching, education, linguistic field. And so if that's the word God is using, let's try and use that. And I think it will really also help us keep us focused on what God's laws are doing, what his instructions are doing. Because immediately, as soon as you just change that word, God's law versus God's instructions, I mean, don't you already feel like, oh, okay, like, all right, like this guy's not as bad as I thought he was. Like, okay, this is maybe for my good, which it always is. All right, so now that we've established, like, all right, we're going to say, or you could even just say Torah in your head, like just retrain your brain to like think in terms of Torah, because that's what it is. If you don't like instruction, though it's a better translation, like we could just talk about it in terms of the Torah, which is, I mean, still what Jews refer to the first 5 books. They divide their our Old Testament scriptures, their entire scripture, into the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So just think in your mind Torah, like every time you see law, this is the Torah, this is God's instructions. But what is the Torah? I mean, that is, it says he's going to teach this instruction. This is what Moses is about to explain. But what does he have in his mind? What is it that he's going to explain? There are different levels of Torah, I guess I would say. So the first one, when people refer, like the smallest encapsulation, is the 10 Commandments. So this is the instruction, the Torah, that God gives Moses on Mount Sinai. You find them in Exodus 20. You also find them again in Deuteronomy 5. We will cover them. And they are 10 instructions. They're not actually commandments. I know that's kind of a confusing term. Nowhere in the Old Testament does Hebrew scripture use the word commandments to refer to them. They're 10 words, the Decalogue. So that's like kind of the encapsulation, like we have these 10. And then right after that in Exodus, they were expounded by God in what's called the Book of the Covenant. So that's Exodus 21 through 23. If you're reading through it, then you get like this larger section. More detail, more instruction added after the Book of the Covenant. That was Exodus 21 through 23. You have the Holiness Code. That is Leviticus 17 through 26. So we're getting bigger every time, bigger boxes. So Decalogue, 10 Commandments, Book of the Covenant, Holiness Code in Leviticus. And then we get Deuteronomy, which is called the Torah of Deuteronomy, which technically they would say picks up in chapter 5 through verses 26. This is where he's expounding on what we would say a lot of commandments, statutes, laws, lots of different words are used for them. But then as this goes on, ever increasing, eventually all 5 books, the first 5 books, become known as the Torah of Moses. So by the time you get to Jesus and he's referring to the Torah or they're referring to the law, a lot of times they're referring to all 5 books. They might, based on context, be speaking maybe just of the Decalogue, but that term can now be used to refer to all 5 books. As Moses is speaking, he's most likely speaking about Decalogue, Book of the Covenant, Holiness Code, and he's creating Deuteronomy. And then as leaders, priests, prophets, rabbis will continue to then draw on all 5 of the books to talk about the Torah of Moses, the instruction. So by Jesus' time, definitely all of Deuteronomy is part of the Torah. And just as a little bit of trivia, if you think it's, wondering, why should I study Deuteronomy? Why is it important? If I haven't given you enough reasons, it's Jesus' favorite book. How do I know this? Because he quotes it the most. If you go by number of quotations, Deuteronomy is the one he's pulling at the most. And then when you get to Jesus, we've had this expanding, right? And then Jesus will confront the rabbis and the Pharisees for like making the Torah this, like endless, like drawing boundaries around boundaries and making the law kind of this ever expanding beast, right? Like kind of like the bureaucracy of the United States, like it never gets smaller, right? Like once you let it go, it just keeps going, and he's going to call them out for the ways they've just expanded it and bloated it beyond its meaning. And then they're going to ask him, so what do you think it is? Is it just the 10 words? Is it Holiness Code? What is it? 2 things. Love God, love your neighbor. And so we see the Torah of God start as 10 words, and Jesus is going to say it's all the same, but it's going to come down to basic principles. And when we study the 10 Commandments in chapter 5, we'll see You can distill it all down to 2 principles. Love God, love people. But right now we're still in that expounding, because it's really easy to say love God and love people, but I have no clue how to. I still don't have any clue how to do it. So we're going to keep studying. The other thing that the Torah is, I'm going to define it by what it is not. And this is really, really important to me that we all grasp. Torah is not, it is not the means by which one is saved or achieves God's blessing. God has already blessed Israel. He has already chosen Israel. He has already redeemed Israel. When God calls Abraham and gives him the great promises that maybe you read through this week, when he promises to give them land, when he promises to increase their number, there is no Torah. There is no Exodus. There's no holiness code. There's no book of the covenant. There's none of that. He just says, I'm going to do this for you. The very minimum, what we could say that an only instruction, kind of contingency he says is go. He tells Abraham, go to the land, and then it'll be yours. And he knocks him out when he promises him, like, to give him ancestors. Like, Abraham's pretty much, like, passed out. He's in some sort of trance when God is promising him. God's initial promises are unilateral. Like, he's the only one doing them. And when he saved them out of slavery in Egypt, he does not require them to meet these stipulations. He does not even require them to sign on the dotted line first. Like, okay, I'm going to redeem you, but after you get out, we're going to go to Sinai, and then you're going to have this stuff. So do you agree in advance? Like, all right, here. No, that covenant comes afterwards. He pulls them out. He does tell them, you gotta be covered by the blood of the lamb, but like, you do that, we're going. And Pharaoh's chasing, and we're going. And they're through the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's armies are drowned, and they come to Mount Sinai. He's like, all right, you see what I can do? You want to be my people? And they're like, yeah, we're good. Like, sign us up. That is a great deal. So Torah is not given as a means to be saved. It is given as a means of grace. Torah is the gift of grace to God's people to instruct them on how to live as the righteous people of Yahweh, so that Yahweh can dwell among them and they live and fulfill their national calling to be a blessing. That's really great news. And you guys are like, okay. Because they never get the hang of it, though. That's kind of like the spoiler alert after Deuteronomy. Like, they just never get it. But that's what the prophets are going to call back to. The prophets aren't coming up with stuff new. They're going back to Torah. And they're going to say, remember if we did this? Remember if we act like this? This is what our God does. Like, he wants to save us. He wants to bless us. Like, this is just all we have to do, and they can't get it. They can't get it done. During the exile, Torah is what they're going to call back to. Because as we're going to find at the end of the book, exiles actually means that God is still keeping his promise. Because curses are part of the covenant. He's still holding up his end of the bargain. Like, come back to me. Because God always keeps his promises. And then when Jesus comes to the earth, that's what he is quoting. And that's what he is embodying. And that's what he is fulfilling. He is constantly calling people back. So the Torah is this given grace. And then Jesus comes and he embodies that grace. But from first to last, Torah is not death in itself. Torah is not a punishment. Torah is not domineering, because Torah is a gift of grace from God. The other reason that I'm fully convinced that Torah is a gift of grace is this. Remember, the first chunk is the Ten Commandments, and they are given at Mount Sinai. And the meeting at Mount Sinai, when God fulfills his covenant, or makes his covenant, the Sinaitic covenant with the people, occurs 50 days after they have left Egypt, or 50 days after Passover. When God gives all the national festivals that they are to keep, one of those occurs 50 days after Passover. It's called the Festival of Weeks, and it celebrated the first harvest, the first fruits of the harvest. But as time went on in the Jewish community, that also came to be known as a festival where they celebrated the giving of the Torah, because it happened at the same time, 50 days after Passover. Okay, so we have talked about the who, when, where, what, the Torah, and the why. We've done our 5 WH questions. And now the how. How is Moses going to do this? How is Moses going to relate to the people and explain and expound what Torah is? And this, in some ways, is a simple answer. It's not overly complicated, but it's also kind of profound. And that is that they're going to hear it. He's giving sermons, right? He's going to preach it to them, and they're going to hear it. Now, let's remember that this is the only way most of them can take this information in. This is a pre-literate culture, meaning it's not that like they're illiterate, but they don't need to be literate. This is not a culture that survives like ours does on being able to read and write. They don't need it, so they have no need to learn it. Moses has learned it because Moses grew up in a palace. So they're going to hear it, and it is in hearing the word as a community that then they will learn it. And I just listen to how many times when you read through Deuteronomy, he gives them the injunction to hear it, hear it, hear it, and then to learn it. Because there is this pattern that Moses is laying out, that when you hear it, and then you need to learn it, and then the priests are called into that process. They are supposed to help explain it. That's part of the priestly class, is to preach it, to read it out loud, and then to help them understand as generations continue. And when we hear it in community, and then we learn it, the next step should be to fear it. I'm going to go back one step. So we hear it, and then you need to learn it. Like, we show up a lot, and we hear it, and we never learn it. And then sometimes we learn it, but the next step is fear. So you hear, you learn, and you fear. And I don't mean like being scared. I mean like the fear of the Lord, the reverence, the awe, that these are the words and instructions of a holy, living, righteous, just God that I am learning. Because a lot of people learn a lot of knowledge, a whole lot of knowledge about the Bible, about theology, and then it's a weapon. They have no fear of God in them. And they use it to bludgeon people, they use it to beat people up, they use it to domineer and have authority. And let me tell you, if you've learned to fear God in that, you will not do that. Because you are using the words of a holy and righteous God to assume authority and abuse his people. He is not going to stand for that. So we are to hear it, we are to learn it, we are to do it to fear God, and then hopefully we will obey it. Because then there's that other step that if you leave out fear, sometimes people may not use God's word as a weapon or to domineer, but they skip the fear part and they go straight to obey. And that's nothing but legalism. They might be obeying out of like genuine fear, like God's going to strike me with a lightning bolt. But I think in biblical terms, fear does not mean being scared. It is the reverence. It is the awe. And part of that, I think, is also remembering, some part of the awesomeness of God is that he is righteous and he is just, but he's also loving and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, faithful and steadfast to generations. And there's an awe in that as well. Like, that is the God who I'm learning about. That is the God who I'm serving. That is the God who I'm supposed to be like, is this one who's just abounding in steadfastness and love and compassionate. I could not say that about myself. Hear, learn, fear, obey. And Moses can tell you, and then you live. That is how you live. That is the process. When you start with hearing it, and you'll get to obey. But God is not a God who's just trying to require our obedience. He's not a mean father. He's not a domineering parent. He's not a boss or teacher or anyone in authority who just wants obedience for obedience sake so that everything is neat and clean and orderly and just everything goes okay. He wants you to live in abundance. He wants you to have abundant life, and he knows, I created you, this is the way to get it. I want to be in a relationship with you. This is how you get it. And then, that's still not the end of the road. A lot of us grew up thinking like, okay, like the end of the road is like salvation, or the end of the road is like to be blessed. If you read the promises to Abraham back in Genesis, the end goal of being blessed, of being given life, is to be a blessing. The national motto of Israel is supposed to be to expand. They were supposed to, though they never will, they never did, to show other nations their wisdom and slowly expand, not to be an empire, not to rule and domineer over other countries, but because they're going to be like, we want to be a part of that. We want that God. We want to co-sign with these people. Look at them. They are nice to each other. They value truth. Everyone is safe. Everyone is secure. Their God tells them what to do. Their crops grow. it's supposed to be so alluring that then they go out and spread that and let other people come in. They're never going to get there, but that is the way that God is laying out for them in Deuteronomy. So Moses is going to preach it. They also are going to have passages from Deuteronomy that become so important. He will tell them, teach this to your children. And these will be some of the first passages that they will learn, Jewish children will learn as they grow up. It would have been some of the first passages that Jesus learned as he grew up himself. As he learned to speak, he would be speaking the words of Deuteronomy. Kings are supposed to make a personal copy of Deuteronomy to have with them at all times on how they're supposed to live. And one final note, just as we talk about it, we're still in the Old Testament. We're still walking through progressive revelation. So when I'm saying life, and when you read life in Deuteronomy, we know that God is giving us eternal, abundant life eventually. This is not what he's talking about here. He's talking about like an actual life with crops and security. The New Testament concept of eternal life has not been revealed yet. I mean, they're just clinging to temporal hope right now. And he is promising that to them as he is setting the stage for his coming revelation, as he is building the nation through which the kings and then the Messiah will come, as he is building a way to, in greater and greater ways, reveal who he is and his salvific plan. So Moses is using life very temporally. And as we get through it, it's going to be a little bit trickier for us to go through, because we know that like not every woman who follows Jesus has babies, and sometimes the crops don't grow, and sometimes there's not money, and sometimes we're not safe. And so those are things that we have to deal with, as Moses means clearly a temporal, safe, secure, blessed life. What does that mean for us? And also, one final note on Torah and how they were taking it in is that it wasn't given to see that the people would fail. It wasn't given to be like, look, this is my standard and you're going to miss it. It was given to let the people know the character of the God they served. This is your God. I mean, the 10 Commandments even start. Often we think, the first commandments, you shall have no other God. That's not how it starts. It starts, I am Yahweh, your God, who rescued you out of Egypt. Our God is the God who rescues. Our God is the God who saves. And our God is the God who says, be my people. Have no other gods but me. And here's how you be my people. Here's how you can be my holy people. Torah is the way he continued his covenant promises, and he established his people through whom he would bring ultimate redemption of all creation. He's just setting the stage, and yet in a beautiful way we can see the foreshadow of all that is to come. Okay, I had more on the second section, but I think maybe I will wrap it up. So, I maybe can write this down, like type it out and post it on the introduction to the first address or something to get to you guys. So, but we will close it, and then how do you want to do questions? Just ask them. Well, let's start with this way. Any questions or reflections immediately, like something that I said, or don't you love the open up one?
Can you reiterate when you were expounding on the Decalogue, the Levitical law?
Okay.
Restate that.
Okay. So the first Torah that God gives his people is the Decalogue. Which is the 10 Commandments. We call it 10 Commandments. Decalogue is also a way. It means 10 words. We get that in Exodus 20. Exodus 21 through 23 is the book of the covenant. Leviticus 17 through 26 is known as the Holiness Code. Then Deuteronomy 5 through 26 is the book of Deuteronomy, the book of the Torah. Moses' I'd have to look up the exact way, but that's where he's really expounding upon Torah, I would say, more like what we would more classically refer to. But all of these sections are also always preceded by narrative history. Like, here's what God did, here's what God did, here's what God did. There is never Torah that is given without reflection on the character of God and what he's done in the past. Oh, and then the first 5 books. And then you get Genesis through Deuteronomy. Pentateuch, yeah. We like to use the Pentateuch.
Any other questions? Comments? Jen?
Yeah.
So it's really, it really impacted me about like the Torah being the teaching, and how you explain like the law in the context of that we think of law. So when the people, like I'm just thinking of, men, women, children, when they were hearing Moses, they would have understood then. They wouldn't have like taken what Moses was teaching them as like a condemnation. They would have taken it as like an instruction.
A gift, yes. They would have taken it as a gift. And then you have to think about how that gift then gets down. As we go on, we'll read passages about Moses saying like, talk about them with your children. But one of the first things he tells them to teach them is Yahweh is your God, Yahweh alone. You shall love him with all your heart, with all your soul. It's not, the first thing they learn isn't do not steal, do not commit adultery. No, the first thing they're supposed to be learning is God's redemptive acts, is to love him. But over time, because it is human nature to gravitate to very black and white rules, they're going to come to see the law as like the law, and this is what we got to do, guys. This is what we got to do. Like domineering and like, we got to do it better. We got like perfectionism, legalism, and they're going to push it till they're like, we can bring it back. We can bring this nation back. We can get it back if we just do it well enough. And it comes from a good place, but there's also just a lot of losing sight of it. I mean, just as we are prone to do with all things when we are given really helpful guidance, and then it just becomes the gospel. So when you get to Paul and you're reading it, it doesn't undo what this means. It doesn't undo what God meant for the Torah. You're seeing Paul reflect on what the law is in his context and how it's being used. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, Caitlin.
So like it kind of sometimes thought about like the law essentially, because Jesus was crucified by people that upheld the law so human the way they do. That's what killed him. Essentially. Because they were like, oh, you did this.
A dedication to the law rather than to the lawgiver. And yeah, like.
It's kind of ironic how like all.
Yeah. They took a good and perfect gift that was for their good. I mean, I think we could all go with lots of examples of ways that we do this. And in attempting to get back to the blessings, distorted it. And yeah, they were so mad at Jesus because of the way he was to them, totally reinterpreting it. And he wasn't. And I think then when Paul meets Jesus, he knows all of this, and it like, wow, it was always there. Mary Ellen.
I think that hearing about like the Torah and like law being instruction, especially when we were talking about how mixing foods and fabrics, it wasn't just like a list of rules that you had to follow, but that it was a reflection of what their values were and like who God was, and it was lived out holiness of like we're not going to mix these things and be set, like we're going to be set apart. And I just never heard it stuff like that.
Well, you had a really good phrase that you used when you were talking about Torah was given as a means of grace, and then you expounded on that.
Oh, I mean, that one I actually wrote down, because sometimes I'm like, okay, I want to say this right. Where did I put it? I think I got order.
You said Torah was given as a means of grace, and then you expounded on that.
Torah is a gift of grace to God's people to instruct them how to live as the righteous people of Yahweh, so that Yahweh can dwell among them and they may live and fulfill their national calling to be a blessing. So, and also there's a purpose, and there's a purpose beyond ourselves. There is a purpose beyond, for Israel, there was a purpose beyond their communal redemption. There is a purpose for us beyond our redemption. There's a purpose beyond our salvation that God is calling us to partner with him, to become part of a community, and then to make Jesus attractive for people to know that this is our God, and he's so great, and we want to live out his righteousness because it is attractive. Legalism is not attractive, but righteousness is attractive.
Almost like drinking from a fire hydrant.